Coming up next, Steven Universe. Later, Adventure Time on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, DC Nation on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Courage the Cowardly Dog on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Codename Kids Next Door on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Scaredy Squirrel on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Codename Kids Next Door on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Diary of a Wimpy Kid on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Tom and Jerry Tales on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Cartoon Planet on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Dreamworks Dragons Riders of Berk on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Ben 10 Omniverse on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Grojband on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Almost Naked Animals on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, What's New, Scooby-Doo on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, more What's New, Scooby-Doo on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Ninjago, Masters of Spinjitzu on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Ed, Edd and Eddy on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Looney Tunes on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Lego Star Wars The Empire Strikes Out. Later, Lego Star Wars Padawan Menace on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Tom and Jerry Blast Off to Mars on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Teen Titans Go on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, more Teen Titans Go. Later, anew The Amazing World of Gumball on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, anew The Amazing World of Gumball. Later, a new Clarence on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, a new Clarence on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, a new Adventure Time. Later, a new regular show on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, a new regular show. Later, a new Mad on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, a new Mad. Later, Annoying Orange on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Annoying Orange on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Annoying Orange. Later, Mad on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Mad on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, a new Almost Naked Animals on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, a new Johnny Test on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, a new Pokemon the Series XY on Cartoon. Coming up next, Pokemon Black and White Adventures in Unova on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Pokemon Black and White Rival Destinies on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, a new Grojband on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, a new Teen Titans Go on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, new Sonic Boom on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, more Codes Wrong Revenge of the Eye. Coming up next, The Amazing World of Gumball on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, more The Amazing World of Gumball on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, more of The Amazing World of Gumball. Later, Adventure Time on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Clarence on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, more Clarence on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, regular show. Later, more regular show on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, more regular show on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Teen Titans Go on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
More Teen Titans Go!
later
Clarence!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Incredible Crew!
later
Regular Show!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Regular Show!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
A New Clarence!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Steven Universe!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
More Steven Universe!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Uncle Grandpa!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
More Uncle Grandpa!
later
Clarence!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Total Drama World Tour!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
The Looney Tunes Show!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
The Tom and Jerry Show!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
New The Amazing World of Gumball!
later
More of The Amazing World of Gumball!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Teen Titans Go!
later
Johnny Test!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
More Teen Titans Go!
later
Regular Show!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Scooby-Doo! Curse of the Lake Monster!
on Cartoon Network.
It was at this moment he knew he fucked up.
Hit him with it! Hit him with it! Hit him with it!